we are in transition, we have to be creating new worlds, and we have to be creating them across kingdom. And if we are too attached to absolute wins and perfect outcomes, we're already lost.
Well, hello, and welcome back to the Book on Fire. This is Dave.
And this is Janet.
Hey, we realized that we are a little bit late with this episode coming at you, or late as far as the precedent that we've set so far. We've been on a pretty reliable every 2-week schedule, and we are recording this episode on Sunday, April 14th, which is usually when episodes would come out. It's going to take a few days for me to edit and get this one ready. But it's springtime here in the mountains of North Carolina, like utterly springingly, gorgeously, exuberantly spring. And that means that the pace of our life has quickened up quite a bit. For those of you who don't know very much about what we do when we're not reading and talking about books. We are herbalists, and we have an herb school, a school of herbal medicine that runs from 6 months from mid-April to mid-October, and that is getting ready to start here in just about 2 days. And on top of that, we live on a off-grid land project where we have a medicinal plant nursery and a big medicinal herb garden. And we have resident apprentices who come and live with us for the summer and who have just moved in, and we've gotten settled into their accommodations, and we've been potting up plants for the nursery and thinking about getting the spring garden going and doing all of this stuff. And so yeah, this one is coming to you a little late, but it's coming to you. And as we're nearing the end of the book that we're reading, Donna Haraway-Staying with the Trouble, these episodes, we're not going to promise a release schedule for this last part, because we just have to squeeze it in between everything else as our lives get busier and busier. And if you do want to find out more about what we're doing, we have social media presences, and we're online. The Terra Silva School is the name of our herb school, and our nursery and apothecary herb outfit is called Medicine County Herbs. I'll put links to all that stuff in the show notes to the episode in case y'all want to track down more about what we're up to.
And we have a blog.
And we have a blog called Radical Vitalism, where we irregularly publish lots of things about herbalism and just living on the planet, sharing medicinal herb knowledge and stuff too, and sharing thoughts about what it means to be an herbalist at this time and place. So yeah, today we're talking about 2 chapters from Staying with the Trouble, Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. Chapter 6 called Sowing Worlds, and Chapter 7 called A Curious Practice. And that leaves only one chapter after today, and that's going to be Chapter 8. It's called The Camille Stories. Looking forward to that one. It's the only chapter that Haraway wrote fresh from scratch just for this book. And it's a bit longer, it looks like. And so the next episode after this will be us talking about the Camille Stories, Chapter 8. And then we'll probably we're planning to do one, or if it gets too long, maybe we would split it into 2 episodes of just wrap up conversation about the book as a whole. Whenever we can get around to getting all of those out, we'll get them out. And then we'll probably take something of a break. The summer, we're going to be really busy all the way through October. But that doesn't mean there won't be any episodes. There might be some one-offs or whatever, but there's a good chance that we won't tackle a new book chapter by chapter until maybe fall or something at least.
But we might do some articles online, or we might just read a book or talk about one of the books we've already read and just discuss it, and ones that we feel like are short enough to actually fit into one episode that we think would be useful to continue the conversation we started with this book. So we might do some of that. We'll see. Depends how much time we have for that.
Yeah, so we have some ideas about keeping the podcast going through the growing season. So keep us subscribed if you subscribe, and you'll likely see some stuff come trickling in, or maybe more. Like, we'll see. But anyway, we'll talk about all of this before we sign off at the end of Staying with the Trouble again. But we just wanted to give you an idea about not only why we're late, but also just kind of what you can expect from here going outward. So yeah, here we are. We're going to talk about these chapters one at a time, basically. And the first one is called Sowing Worlds, a Seed Bag for Terraforming with Earth Others. So just to give an overview of this chapter, what she is talking about is drawing heavily from the work of Octavia Butler and Ursula K. Le Guin, two science fiction writers who are now both gone, but their work has become more relevant than ever in many people's estimation, and Haraway's very much influenced by them. A lot of this chapter has to do with storytelling and sowing seeds literally in the way of creating new worlds, but also sowing seeds in the material of thought and the matter of thought around the world, so that we are telling stories as we're planting seeds to create the next world in this time of transition when there is a lot of upheaval and ground being overturned. It can, while they're in the midst of all this destruction, there is also a possibility of fertility and a place to plant the seeds of future ways of being, especially across kingdom and collaborating with all kinds of beings. Right. That's basically what this chapter is about. We need to sow a lot of new seeds, as it were, of new worlds. And some of those seeds, hopefully, will take and flourish and become the new worlds that we need to continue flourishing. Yes. Yeah, my first impression when I started reading this chapter was that it's kind of a return to form, or a return to a form of Haraway type writing that we'd been enjoying in, like, say, the first 3 chapters of the book. That for the chapters we talked about in the last episode was kind of a divergence from this. Here we are back with that Haraway that kind of free associates ideas and jumps from one context to the next and creates these very, like, evocatively beautiful in her own way, poetic in her own, like, wild wordplay, nerdy kind of way, science fiction type of way, passages that I've come to love from her. And so a lot of this chapter, Sowing World, was just like, I was just breathing in the atmosphere of Donna Haraway, you know, and I was just really just enjoying it, even just on that level, so much. And like right in the very first paragraph of the chapter, we have this passage. I'm just going to read just a few sentences. I'm just going to read some of these for you so that we can have them here together. We need a hardy, soiled kind of wisdom, instructed by companion species of the myriad Terran kingdoms in all their place times. We need to reseed our souls and our home worlds in order to flourish, again, or maybe just for the first time, on a vulnerable planet that is not yet murdered. We need not just reseeding, but also re-inoculating with all the fermenting, fomenting, and nutrient-fixing associates that seeds need to thrive. Recuperation is still possible, but only in multi-species alliance, across the killing divisions of nature, culture, and technology, and of organism, language, and machine. Yeah. She goes on, Janet's going to talk more about this, but yeah, Ursula K. Le Guin and Octavia Butler figure heavily in here. She brings back Ursula K. Le Guin's carrier bag theory of storytelling, which is something that we touched on in when we discussed chapter 2 a few weeks ago. If you were here with us when we talked about that, that might be familiar to you. And you might even recognize some of the language in this passage, which I also underlined. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what concepts we think to think other concepts with. It matters where how Ouroboros swallows its tail again. That's how worlding gets on with itself in dragon time. These are such simple and difficult koans. Let us see what kind of get they spawn. I don't think I have the time or the understanding to go into exactly the way that Haraway uses the word get, because she uses it as a noun. Let's see what kind of get they spawn. So yeah, I just wanted to throw out there a couple of the very nice Haraway poetic passages, that tickled my fancy as I was going through the introduction to this paragraph. But, after these paragraphs here of introductory, kind of getting us warmed up, she goes quickly back into Le Guin's carrier bag theory of fiction.
Can we share the link to that carrier bag?
Yeah, you can find a scan PDF, or I found a scan PDF of carrier bag theory on the internet, and I can include a link to that in the show notes.
That would be great, because
it's a very short essay.
It's short, and it's really good. Ursula K. Le Guin's just such an amazing writer, and it's so well-crafted and tight, while it's talking about really big things. You know, she's so good at it. Just like really pithy and together. But basically, we talked a little bit about the carrier bag theory earlier in one of the episodes, but to remind us all what we're talking about, the carrier bag theory is somewhat in opposition to the prick tale, or to the hero's tale. That is the traditional trope in a lot of world literature, but also in how we conceive of the stories we tell, even not in literary forms, but also in just how the world works and who is important. So,
and what actually counts as a meaningful action.
Yes. So,
or an effective action.
The hero's story, or the prick tale, there is usually a powerful male figure who, even if he doesn't know his own power, the entire story hinges on his actions. And he may be going on a heroic quest. He may have a sword, or maybe his sword is his pen, and his writing and his words and his thoughts are the important movers of the story.
The word, the weapon, the tool, I think, was a list of...
It's in there. Yeah. And then the tool, but often, or it could be something used to tame nature.
Or something cutting. Yeah. Something penetrative.
Right.
You know? Right. Something like that. Yeah. Like it kind of, sometimes it has these phallic type of resonances, like a sword, whatever.
Right. Which is why they call him the prick tale.
Right.
But Le Guin is countering that concept with the carrier bag theory of history and art, which is that the idea that civilization, or just human culture from the very beginning of the tribe and the gathering of our species in small groups, has always depended largely on vessels, either bags or receptacles that can hold things, whether it's gatherings of nuts and roots, or fish, like a net to gather fish up. All of the different means of sustenance that are not...
seeds.
And seeds, too, right? To hold seeds that are not necessarily like the heroic hunting quest, you know? And she's reminding us that culture, and by that I mean what humans create together in groups, has evolved and developed largely with these unsung heroes of our lifeways, which are the receptacles, you know, and they don't get as much of a story, or there's not as much of a place for them in our narratives. And Ursula K. Le Guin is saying it is time for us to remember the important place of these receptacles, and to create new ways of understanding the world based around them, as a way to address the damage done by focusing so much on the hero's tale or the prick tale.
I want to bring in the word gathering here too, which has come up in several of our episodes, and I can remember in Involutionary Momentum and all this kind of stuff. It's like a theme in this book, and you know, because you gather things in a net, a basket, a bag, right? And so part of what Le Guin is proposing is that it might be more important what you gather than what you sever. Or at least it's, if not more important, it's at least important. You know, we should have a carrier bag type of storytelling that's about gathering.
Right.
And not just about heroic carving out a path, you know. Yeah.
And I think that Haraway is bringing this theory up again with Octavia Butler and Ursula K. Le Guin in mind as people who were writing carrier bag stories for our futures. And part of what she's getting at here is, so she's referring largely to Octavia Butler's work, the Parable series, the Parable of the Sower and the Parable of the Talents. And in those, Olamina, the protagonist, is traveling in a sort of post-disaster, major disaster, post-apocalyptic world that has a striking similarity to contemporary American culture. But she is traveling and gathering people and gathering community and sowing seeds for creating a world that is life-giving and sustaining. And that's one version of this carrier bag story. But then also, I should add here that part of what's important and which Haraway draws attention to is that Butler is not creating a utopian vision of the world in this way that we think about utopia originally, which is like where everything is perfect. It's a messy utopic drive that Alamina has, and sometimes then there's some difficult things about that world, not just the world that they live in, but the world they create together in her community Earthseed.
Right.
But in Butler's work, there is the acknowledgement that we have to create flourishing, vibrant community and lifeways in the wake of ongoing destruction and surrounded by destruction and scarcity. And Butler
you kind of,
sorry,
if I can interject, and you gather what you need along the way.
Right, totally.
I'm thinking about the Parable books. It's like, it's very, she's on the road, she's gathering people, but also gathering kind of skills and
right.
wisdom, insight.
Right.
And then, like her first project, Acorn, ends up breaking apart and it kind of ends up failing, quote unquote, or something. But it's just another step on this learning process towards evolving with the now and staying with so anyway, not to go too much into the Parable books, but
which you should read, and we can link to those too if you haven't already read them. I think they're pretty important to read right now. People cite 1984 all the time as an important text for right now, but really I think Octavia Butler's work is much more relevant to what we're dealing with in the political climate, with the growing xenophobia and the response to climate chaos worldwide. So the other book that, she refers to a few pieces of Le Guin's work, but she refers to the word for world is forest, which is a novel about a planet of forest-dwelling hominids who Terrans, humans from Earth, have invaded and are very much doing the colonial process of extraction, exploitation, murderous brutality that was done all over the world during the initial era of colonization that is ongoing. And in that book, the forest-dwelling people far outnumber the colonizers that came from Earth, and they have to learn to fight back. And the story is as much about the way their culture is forever changed by the work they have to do to protect their planet and their forest life, as it is about the conflict between colonizers and colonized people. And I don't want to say too much about it, but it's a really amazing story, and it's one in which the outcome is ambivalent, and it's messy, and nothing's perfect, and there is compromise and acceptance of change with mutual influence across species. Part of the point is, even when there can be positive outcomes or possibly positive futures, with both of these powerful writers' works, there is often ambivalence and uncertainty, and also outcomes that maybe you wouldn't have necessarily been rooting for, but they just kind of emerge from the circumstances. And both of them are amazing at writing with just an open end, and you're kind of just like, what happens within the text has to happen. It feels like it just kind of like there's this emergence of like, of course this is what would have happened, and you feel like they might have been as surprised as you when they were writing it, which I think is really cool.
Yeah.
That might not be true at all. I mean, both of them have extensive notes on their work, so they might have actually have planned everything out ahead of time, but that's not the impression I've got from some interviews I've read. All of this is to say that I've been thinking a lot about the way that we talk about how we're going to get out of all this and where we are as a species and with life on the planet, which is what this book is about. And there is definitely a heavy emphasis in the overculture and also a lot of our subcultures on figuring out a heroic path to recuperation or to saving what is left of life on Earth. And Haraway is drawing on these two writers to explain that, or to highlight that the hero's tale is what got us into this, and the hero's tale is not going to get us out of this. There's not going to be some eccentric techno dude who's going to actually figure out the one thing that's going to save everybody. Mm-hmm. There's not going to be one revolution that's going to save everybody. There's not going to be one overarching idea or political framework that's going to save everybody.
Right.
This is going to be a multifaceted conflict, and the point of this chapter is that we are in transition. We have to be creating new worlds, and we have to be creating them across kingdom. And if we are too attached to absolute wins and perfect outcomes, we're already lost, because there is not a chance of a perfect outcome at this point. I wrote a blog piece about this recently that we're going to link to, about cynicism and how appealing cynicism is right now. But the point of her bringing up these two writers is to point to people who are writing about the messiness of our future and how it will be one of collaboration if there is to be a future.
Mm-hmm.
But it may not be one that feels pure and totally, I don't know.
Or done.
Done. Right.
Know?
Yeah.
It'll never be done.
Right. Totally. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I encourage y'all to read Janet's blog post. It's really good. I'm sure you have cynics in your lives, and
you might be one.
You have cynics maybe in yourselves. And her essay addresses all of those pathways to and from cynicism in a way that's really helpful to think with, and that you can use when you're talking to others even about the state of the world.
Thanks.
Going back to Haraway's text, on page 120 we have, Terran spawn all. We are sidewinding as well as arboreal kindred. Blown get. In infected and seedy generation after generation. Blowsy kind after blowsy kind. On the subject of planting seeds, she then says, planting seeds requires medium, soil, matter, mutter, mother. I think this is pretty interesting in the chapter. She comes back a few times to this kind of wordplay around the soil, the matter, mutter, mother. And if you're sowing seeds, then the soil or the medium is what the seed goes into, mm-hmm. and the medium in which it sprouts and grows. Mm-hmm. And Haraway is it's pretty interesting in here how she, in this carrier bag way of storytelling that she's doing throughout this chapter, that she's both talking about and exemplifying, it's always unclear to me whether she's gathering seeds to sow, or whether she's gathering stories and perspectives that get composted into the medium which will be used to grow seeds. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's not one or the other. I don't think that there's an answer. I think that she's delighting in not being strict about what's being sown and what's the compost. The carrier bag is about all of it. And sowing worlds, what's going to be a seed and what's the fertile ground, is something that is not something that's very easily said.
And also, you just reminded me of this way that she's talking about seed and soil that might not be totally apparent to everyone, but often in a lot of the overculture's narrative, going back to Sumeria, even around earth and planting, it has often been a story of domination, and the soil and the earth has been almost like this inert object that you put life into by putting the seed into it. Mm-hmm. And she is always drawing attention to the fact that soil is a living medium that already has many kingdoms involved of life, that has fungal life, that has bacterial life, and moving on up through other kinds of animals and plants. And there are many kingdoms represented in that soil that is not dead, is alive. And it is part of the process. And we are not making it grow food or grow medicine.
Oh, right.
It is already this living, vibrant medium that we are working with.
Right. Right.
And so bringing soil back to life to acknowledge its livingness is part of what she's doing this whole time that might not always stand out to everyone.
Well, yeah, because part of the pricktail, part of the pricktail too, is that the earth is the feminine, mother, receptive medium.
There's air quotes happening during all this, by the way.
And that the seed is the male thing.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Right? I mean, men in this culture talk about their seed or whatever as if, like, it's the thing that is the masculine contribution to growth, And she's definitely undermining all of that. In fact, she says right here, in the feminist SF mode, matter is never mere, quote unquote, mere medium to the, quote, informing seed. Rather, mixed in Terra's carrier bag, kin and get have a much richer congress for worlding.
Right.
Matter is a powerful, mindfully bodied word, the matrix and generatrix of things. But yeah, so it's exactly what Janet's saying. There's a richness to matter, mutter, mother, generatrix, and matrix that is not just receptacle.
And it's not inert.
It's not inert. It's not just a medium. It's not a mere medium. So yeah, this like radical ambiguity, to go back to what I was saying before about like what's the medium and what's the seed, like what's the compost and what's the germ, like all of this stuff is, I think, really cool in the way that she goes about this gathering and about this composting. 'Cause yeah, that's what this chapter is all about, and she goes on to just throw more things in the bag. She's basically like, let's talk about carrier bag theory, and now watch me throw shit in the bag. And, what goes in the bag is Le Guin, Octavia Butler, a few things from Le Guin, and then she actually references a story of Le Guin's called The Author of the Acacia Seeds and Other Extracts from the Journal of the Association of Therolinguistics. That is a story about scientists attempting to read writing that an ant put on some acacia seeds that they found. And these are scientists in a sci-fi world that are able to decipher the writing of animals. And they're trying to figure out what kind of message this ant that was found decapitated next to these acacia seeds had left on the acacia seeds. But without going into that story, Haraway just kind of throws that in the bag and uses it as a springboard to talk about both acacias and ants and ant-acacia relationships. In just a few pretty dense pages at the end of the chapter, she goes into all of this. And so acacias, just really quickly, I'm not going to hit all of the details, but acacia is a very large genus of plants in the legume, the bean family, that grow. I don't think acacias they're not really diversely represented in North America, although I believe there are some native acacias in the drylands. However, there is something like 1,500 species of acacia worldwide, and they're very prominent in Australia, in Africa, especially those continents.
Maybe more desert places. I mean, they're in the Gobi Desert too.
They're a little more dryland adapted. And Haraway, she spends a minute kind of reveling in all the ways that acacias have become important or become iconic in one way or another. For instance, there's like a food ingredient called gum arabic that all of us have consumed in some product or another that comes from acacia trees. And
you can make ink with it.
Acacia honey is a really prized honey that will not crystallize.
Postage stamps
were made from gum arabic.
Yeah.
People eat the seeds, the pods, the shoots, and all of this of the acacias. And then as members of the legume family, acacias also fix nitrogen into the soil, which means that they help other plants grow. They're also in partnership with giraffes who browse on the leafy tops of the large acacias that grow in the savannas in Africa. They create the flat-topped tree savanna landscape that she jokingly says is prized by human photographers and tourist enterprises. So she's kind of reeling in acacia into the story in all of these facets, especially in that list is ways that they intersect with humans, and giraffes and other plants. But, and then there is also, as a subset of acacia relatings and acacia partnerships, there are a lot of different examples of relationships between various acacia species and various ant species. Like, for instance, there are certain acacias that their seeds have what are called elastosomes on them, which are sugary appendages that ants like to gobble up and use for food. And so they lure the ants to the seed, and the ant, desiring to bring home this sugary food packet, grabs the seed and drags it into the ant nest, which also just happens to be the ideal germination site for the acacia seed. So there's a symbiosis there where the ants get fed by the acacia seeds and the acacias get germinated by the ants.
And the ants would also keep out other creatures who would come to get the actual seed and eat it.
Yeah. There's more. She goes in, she talks about ants that bore into the acacia bark, and create these channels. There's a few, she just kind of scatters, in quick succession, she just kind of fires off these ant-acacia relationships. And really, she's not really going anywhere in particular with this, right? Because we're not trying to get there. Remember that part? But it seems to me like in this part, she's gathering. She's throwing examples of relationships into her carrier bag.
Right.
And talking about the diversity of worlds and worldings that go on just around this one genus of tree.
That can also be really invasive and harmful in places in the world, depending on where it is, because it definitely moved around with colonizers as well.
Yeah.
So it's not one that it's always a pretty story. And that's part of what she's talking about is understanding the connections between different species and across kingdom, but also looking at individuals around the world in that context and how are they contributing good or bad to the situation that they live in there, and not that you can say a wholly good or wholly bad, but is one more disruptive? Is it hurting other plants and animals, or is one actually contributing a lot by its presence? Right.
And it's all of these observations and all of these stories that we need to gather in order to, and these are my words, in order to form the compost
Right.
that will grow the new worlds.
Right.
Is sort of, this is the meaning that I'm getting from the way this chapter is proceeding, sort of. And it's on the patterns of these relationships that we notice in the world that we will sow new worlds. So yeah, that's basically how this is going, from kind of a theoretical introduction to the carrier bag theory, and some exemplars of that in writing and in storytelling, and then veering off, as Haraway likes to, into scientific observation of animals and plants and the associations in biology as a way of filling the carrier bag up, And then towards the end, in the second to last paragraph, ends with Le Guin, I am committed to the finicky, disruptive details of good stories that don't know how to finish. Good stories reach into rich pasts to sustain thick presents, to keep the story going for those who come after. Emma Goldman's understanding of anarchist love and rage makes sense in the worlds of ants and acacias. These companion species are a prompt to shaggy dog stories, growls, bites, whelps, games, snufflings, and all. Symbiogenesis is not a synonym for the good, but for becoming with each other in responsibility. She ends the chapter in true to form. In a very Haraway fashion. Okay, on to Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is called A Curious Practice, and it is another short chapter that is basically a tribute to Haraway's friend and colleague, Vincent Desprez. Go ahead and laugh at me for mangling that person's name that time and every other time that I might say the word Desprez, but her last name is Despret, and this is a Belgian philosopher and ethologist, which is a person who studies animal behavior. She's a philosopher, psychologist, and ethologist who, if I'm not mistaken, is Belgian, and was a student of, or at least a mentee of, Isabel Stengers, who's another person who's come up in this book, another colleague of Donna Haraway's. It seems like the three of them are maybe close in some way, at least, academically.
Wouldn't you like to be a fly on the wall at that dinner party?
Yeah, right? Yeah, because these are all extremely fascinating people, and Vincent Desprez has come up, the name has come up in the book previous to this, but I don't think we've talked about her yet on the podcast, and this is a whole chapter devoted to her, and what Haraway is calling her curious practice. And there's wordplay there in the word curious, because it's not only curious as in kind of odd or as in kind of odd, but also it's a practice of curiosity. Mm-hmm. And she's giving Desprez a lot of credit for pursuing her investigations of animals and people in a way that doesn't jump to conclusions, in a way that allows animals and people that she's studying and writing about to surprise us, to not give us easy answers, mm-hmm. To elicit just further surprise and mystery. This is a lot of what I see happening in this chapter is and it's a little bit hard to follow or to get what she's talking about if you're not familiar with this person's work already. Mm-hmm. I actually went and read an article or two, extracurricular reading about Vincent Desprez so that I would have a better context, because throughout the chapter, Haraway refers to these different things that Desprez is known for in her publications, that as if you would already know what she's talking about. And they're all like, before we talk about any of those examples at all, they're all along the way. I just want to make sure, and we'll come back to this at the end, but the main gist that I'm getting is that Desprez is someone who is more of like an interlocutor with her subjects as far as opening up lines of sort of conversation that, and here again we have the theme of like, don't exactly finish up tidily or reach a conclusion. You know, scientists, a lot of times it's like they study animals in order to propose a theory that's like, this is why the animal is doing this across the species. Like, I have interpreted what the meaning of this mating behavior is in this bird, you know, and part of what Haraway likes about Desprez is that she refuses to draw conclusions like that. And one thing is that she refuses to let an individual animal stand for the whole species.
Right.
You know, so that's a very fundamental thing, right? You can see an animal doing something, and you might have a tendency to generalize that this is a feature of the species. It might just be a feature of that individual, or that individual and...
Or a group, like a group of animals are different from each other. Like I remember in Barry Lopez's Of Wolves and Men, which is such an awesome book. He talks about how wolf packs differ, and they each have their own personality, and like one wolf pack, because the members have their own personalities, you know, and so to generalize about wolves is precarious in these ways. Like, it's not going to be total. You can do a little of that sometimes, but it really varies pack to pack and individual to individual.
Yeah. And so it's a form of investigation that's more about forming relationships and seeing what comes out of those relationships than in trying to map the world in some kind of reductionist scientific way. Another thing that I thought was interesting as far as Desprez's kind of origin story, you might say, is that because she comes from a background in philosophy, there is a history of philosophers talking about animals. And, like, for instance, if you've read Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus, let's say, which is a book that a lot of non-philosophers have read, like I've read, and Janet has read, there's a chapter on wolves. There's a chapter that has a lot to do with rats. Those are the two examples that come off the top of my head. And part of Desprez's kind of, I guess, critique of this is like to say that these animals they're not talking about real animals. Like the animals that you go out in the world and find. They're talking about a kind of like storied animal of mythology, like almost like a mythological. It's a human conception of what rat means. It's something that's very culturally constructed.
Or it could be like meta wolf.
Yeah.
You know, it's
right.
More like that almost than even mythic.
So she proceeds from this question of like, what if philosophers talked about actual animals? You know, went into the wild and like watched actual animals. And so that's part of what she does. And there's this jumping off point, another jumping off point for her that is talked about often in relation to her, and Haraway talks about it in this chapter too, or like refers to it obliquely. And it has to do with one morning when Desprez was sitting in her backyard garden and she heard a blackbird singing. Desprez heard the song of the blackbird, and to her, the bird was singing as if the importance of the world was in its song. And that the blackbird knew what importance meant, and that it was teaching Desprez something about importance. And this is one of the episodes in her life that draws her into further conversation and relationship with animals. And I think that, like, I love this story on a couple of different levels, and one of them is, and she actually talks about this, I think, in some of her work, because the sort of knee-jerk reaction to hearing that from a lot of people might be, you're anthropomorphizing this bird.
Right.
To say that the bird has a concept of importance like we do, that it desires to communicate it or to sing the nature of importance. And I really feel like there's this way in which, where people can learn about the concept of anthropomorphization, which is like the fallacy of imputing human characteristics onto non-human animals as a fallacy, because not all animals are human, and, we shouldn't be projecting our human traits onto them. And it can become this kind of knee-jerk, like, sort of gotcha, hey, you're anthropomorphizing, type thing. And Desprez, who's like a trained ethologist and a philosopher of science, and she's not the only one who would say this, says back to that, we're not that special. Like, how do you know this is anthropomorphism? It could just as easily be the case that humans are exhibiting animal traits or are adopting the traits of animals, right? It gets back to the whole question of human exceptionalism.
Totally.
We have these concepts and we have these capacities, and we should assume that the other critters don't. And she's not only transgressing against this assumption, but she's also pointing out how kind of chauvinist that is. So it's interesting. Like, a lot of us have learned, like, not to anthropomorphize, like, that's actually good etiquette. But there's another, and there's maybe a grain of truth in there or something, but then there's also this larger point, which is that we are animals. We are continuous with the animal world. And in the interest of dismantling human exceptionalism, we shouldn't be so hasty to condemn people describing a continuity of affect and cognition and emotion and just world experience between us and the other critters.
Right. Yeah, and I think that when you talk to me about all of this background with her, I think it's really interesting, especially because where she comes up in this chapter partially, well, it's all about her, but the part that, Haraway refers to her Desprez studies of Israeli ornithologist Amatz Zahavi, and she seems to see within his work or his study of the Arabian babblers a positive example of scientific inquiry. I don't know. I haven't read her work on him, and I need to study that because I'm interested. But I was really surprised to see him come up in this chapter, definitely as a positive example, because along what Dave was talking about the anthropomorphizing and that being this, like, absolute fallacy in science with animals, I think of Zahavi as someone who would have that opinion. Because I just read this other book called The Evolution of Beauty by Richard O. Prum, which is a pretty popular science book right now, so you may have heard of it. The subtitle is How Darwin's Forgotten Theory of Mate Choice Shapes the Animal World and Us. And briefly, to summarize how evolutionary biology explains things, explains how different animals act and why they act. Darwin, when he first created his On the Origin of the Species, felt like it had a huge gap that did not explain a lot of animal behavior and a lot of animal phylogenetic characteristics, especially the wide range of behaviors and plumage in birds, and sexual differences specifically. And there's really funny quotes from this period in his life where he would be like, every time I think of the peacock, I am nauseous. because there was no good explanation for what had happened to male peacocks or how male peacocks had evolved that could be explained through fitness adaptation. It does not make a peacock more fit to have this giant cumbersome tail that it only uses during courtship, you know? Mm-hmm. So why does it have it? And so many sexual differences actually seem to be not very adaptive or helpful in the survival of the species when you look at them. And in fact, up until now that there's actually mathematical analysis of all this, they are not adaptive. It can be proven that these characteristics are not adaptive, whether it's the elaborate bowers of the bowerbird or the giant tail of the peacock or the elaborate collaborative mating rituals of other birds, or primates even. So back then in Darwin's time, he wrote a book about mate selection and how that shapes the world. And that was immediately rejected because of, for a lot of reasons, and Prum goes into those, and it's pretty interesting to hear about Victorian sexism and how that influenced the rejection of Darwin's theory of mate selection. But he did posit another theory to fill in the gaps for what fitness adaptation did not work for. As I mentioned, recently in the past few decades, it has been, or maybe it's even been 50 years at this point, but recently in evolutionary biology, there has been scientific evidence through mathematical analysis that adaptation doesn't explain everything, and there are some gaps here. And so people have been struggling to, within that, the people who are very attached to everything making sense and nature having a rhyme and reason and every single characteristic being actually adaptive or it wouldn't exist, have been struggling to explain why there are all these ways of being in animals that don't seem to help with species adaptation. So the point of all this is, in The Evolution of Beauty, Zahavi comes up as a evolutionary biologist who is interested in protecting the idea that every trait is adaptive. And he came up with a theory called the handicap principle, which explains phylogenetic and behavioral characteristics in male birds that seem non-adaptive. And his theory is that a giant tail or a really cumbersome mating display or behavior the more difficult it is, the more it shows how strong you are as an individual, which would make you prove that you have better genes. This is obviously, I think, to most people, doesn't totally make sense, and sure enough, mathematically, this principle does not work out. So Zahavi was proven wrong mathematically, but his idea about the handicap principle, that the more cumbersome a courtship display or ritual, the stronger your genes are, has not actually played out to be true, but it's still held as the gold standard in evolutionary biology. And so it's interesting to me that Desprez went and studied him and was sympathetic with his work, because it sounds like these Arabian babblers are really amazing. They have a ton of altruistic behaviors. They have elaborate collaborative dancing rituals that don't seem to be tied to courtship and mating, that don't seem to have a reproductive advantage. And he seems to be studying these birds in a way and setting up his experiments in a way to show that all of these behaviors, whether they are caring for another's young or dancing with other birds, is actually proving competitive advantage. And to me, I'm seeing in there, like, that sounds like he's just trying to prove that everything's about fitness, that he's saying that it can't be possible that these birds just developed a collaborative and mutually nourishing culture together, because that would be anthropomorphic to him, probably. Mm-hmm. But why is it more possible that it's individual competition driving this and not collaboration and a really special life way of these Arabian babblers that they've developed together? Right.
It's unclear to me from just reading what's in Haraway's book, and I didn't read enough of Desprez's other stuff to figure this out, but whether Desprez is a fan of Zahavi's conclusions, she's definitely seems to like something about his methods.
Right.
And it seems like that is what is getting most of the attention. What she or what Haraway think of his conclusions would be an interesting thing to know.
Right.
Because everything that you just said, yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I didn't read The Evolution of Beauty, but for sure I hear all of that and how his conclusions would be problematic. But there's a way in which part of what is important for Desprez is situations where the person who's supposed to be investigating a subject becomes transformed by their work.
Right.
And the Blackbird thing is an example of that. She was like, I was transformed. She says, I was transformed by the song of the Blackbird and its expression of importance. It had a transformational effect, which sent me off in a different direction. You know, so she's looking for relationships where, and specifically scientists is what she studied a lot. Oh, but she also studies these farmers.
Yeah,
right?
breeders.
Breeders who breed pigs. And also, it's not just scientists, but people who relate with animals, whether it's, as breeders, as farmers, as scientists who study them, and
pigeon fanciers.
Pigeon fanciers who are in turn transformed by their experience with the animals. And I feel like she sees that in Zahavi.
Right. That
somehow.
Makes sense, sure.
And I think that's most of what she's writing about. But thanks for bringing in all of that other stuff. It's super fascinating about the mate selection.
Yeah. It's just ironic in that it's that thing that happens where, like, when you're reading something, suddenly all these other... I thought I was reading a couple pretty different books, because Staying with the Trouble is very different from The Evolution of Beauty. And somehow they end up colliding in this way that makes me think harder about both of them, you know, and that cool way that reading, like, opens your life to different ideas, and they seem to kind of start having a synchronicity to them, you know.
It's always cool whenever books
line up,
intersect anyway.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, that's really neat. Always really generative. So let's see, what else do we want to say about this chapter and what Desprez is doing? Yeah, she's an explorer of human-animal relations and human-animal communication, and in a way that holds open possibilities. A lot of what Haraway is stressing in this chapter is sort of like in the last chapter, but the non-finitude, the very, like, the partial, not grandiose, not drawing conclusions. It's almost like we're still in the contrast between the pricktail and the carrier bag here, even though she doesn't use that language in this chapter at all, because she's very much aligning Desprez with the kind of work, the kind of working and being in the world that is not like trying to answer the big questions or, you know, trying to finally make things right, or it's all about creating fertile connections that we don't know what they will generate. And with Desprez, it's these connections that are connections with animals, between humans and animals. What can we learn from animals? There's a book by Vincent Desprez translated into English I saw when I was doing my research. I think it's called What Would Animals Say If We Asked the Right Questions? This is very much, you know, this is very on the theme. It's like, we can have these conversations, we can engage with non-human animals, we can engage with critters if we open ourselves in the right ways. And Haraway, Desprez is a model of how we can be this radically open and radically non-conclusive.
And I think that probably something we're going to have to save for another time that Dave brought up with me earlier today is that enough of a goal? And, you know, with how much there is at stake, is this a time for just rambling curiosity and writing and thinking? You know, not that we have to have one way or the other, but
right.
Is it enough?
Well, and it's almost, so, all right, so for y'all, for the listeners, this is something that we're not going to totally unpack this now, but I want to flag this thought for later, and I think I would like to come back to it in one of our wrap-up episodes. And that is, what Janet's talking about, where towards the end of this chapter especially, there's this sense in which like Janet said, not that we have to have one or the other, but Haraway almost seems to be arguing for one over the other.
Mm-hmm.
And if you lost us, what we're talking about is she seems to be arguing for this like radical, exploratory, relationship building, becoming with, sympoietic, all of these things, but this very non-conclusive, like non-goal oriented, really.
It seems like it. Yeah.
Kind of making relationships and sowing worlds, which I'm totally gaga about. Like, I love that. But the step that she is always seems to me, it's like very close to going beyond saying that that's a good thing, but saying she's contrasting it with goal-oriented activity. There's all of this stuff. I could read you some quotes in here, but about like doing something for a noble cause, you know, and how that's the way we should not be thinking.
Right.
And there's a book by Isabel Stengers and Vincent Desprez called Women Who Make a Fuss, which I think is a great title, which it kind of riffs off of Virginia Woolf, which is one of my favorite authors in a way. You know, and Haraway says, making a fuss is not making a revolution.
Mm-hmm.
But it's in this way where she doesn't seem to just be using it so that you know better what she's talking about. She seems to be saying, I'm all about this fuss making more than like this revolution making or something. And so my question is, I have lots of questions, but one of them is like, don't we have room for both?
Right.
And don't the world making, sowing seeds, sympoietic, becoming with, isn't that generative of the possibilities of the kinds of alliances and partnerships that could build to something transformative, that actually transforms the world?
Right.
In the direction of greater flourishing for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I call the revolution.
Right.
You know, there will be some ruptures, there will be some, you know, the old order, the power structures, all of this stuff will be undermined or give way in some way. I mean, who knows what it would look like. But that the work that Haraway is always talking about doing, for me, is complementary to the goal-oriented? I mean, I'm not sure if it's exactly goal-oriented, but it's part of the longing to see big change happen. You know, to make the, not like the revolution as in we're going to take over the White House and, take over the government, but just, have a systemic transformation of what's going on.
From the ground up.
Yeah, and she's, in lots of ways in here, she's in subtly and not so subtly ways, basically saying, the way I'm reading this is don't think about that.
Right.
That's not what we should be thinking about. We should just be staying, like the book's called Staying with the Trouble, it's just focusing on the now, the unfoldings of the relationships that we can build without really thinking about where it's headed or what we want out of it. And this feels very different than the Haraway of the 1980s and 90s, and it also feels like something I just want to have more conversation around, because I don't want to throw out the lowercase r revolution.
Right.
So that's the conversation I want to flag.
I just want to add to that I perceive part of what is going on with her, and I would also say Le Guin in some cases, because I actually want to read a quote from Le Guin at the end, but part of what I see going on with her preference for the carrier bag approach, for the preference for this sort of curious practice that is being talked about in this piece, is that she is saying the prick tale, the hero's tale, the human-centered, male-centered tale is what got us into this mess, and we're not going to be able to use that to get out of this.
Yeah.
And I see that at the same time that I have to say, guess what? There's a bunch of pricks, guns, swords, and pens pointed at us right now. And as the growing chaos continues and another world is at stake, when we're facing a very powerful and organized force who are armed and interested in defining what that space looks like, can we only use the carrier bag to be able to sow that world in that climate?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't even know. See, here we're starting to have the conversation. But like, I'll say here that just because there's guns and knives aimed at us, you know, by the cops and military and stuff, I don't necessarily think that we need to aim the same kinds of weapons back at them.
Sure.
Necessarily. But there is, like, I do think that I tend to think that we should have an analysis of what is opposed to what we're trying to do.
Oh, sure.
And that we're
not living in a vacuum.
And, it's not just this damaged world that we get to re-terraform to our liking experimentally with this world sowing, because there's actually opposition to us being able to do that. And the opposition is not going anywhere anytime soon. You know, so if we don't think about what our opponents are doing and actively try to undermine the things that give them power, and that doesn't mean, I don't mean with bombs or something, it can be with gardens,
right.
You know, but I think that's just part of that to me feels like an essential part of our thinking.
We have to talk about what is dominating us and what is keeping us from sowing the worlds we want to sow. Right. And I think that this is a good time to point out that seeds themselves, literal seeds, are very much a site of contention and a battleground. You know, the biggest seed bank in the world is where they're collecting seeds in a climate-secure place in Scandinavia, I don't remember which country, is owned by Monsanto and the Gates Foundation. And so people are already planning for the future. Well, I should say corporations, even though they're treated as people, they are not people. They are already preparing for the coming scarcity. And if Monsanto continues in the way of seed sharing that it has been up until now, this isn't going to look very good for most people. So seeds themselves are a battleground. They are not neutral. We should all be saving seeds, collecting seeds, and at the same time that we build a fertile materia mater, mother, to grow those seeds in. Yeah. And I mean that in every sense of the word.
Yeah. So, if you have thoughts about this, you can always write us at thebookonfirepodcast@gmail.com or participate in our discussion forum on Facebook, The Book on Fire Podcast. Also, I'm very excited to retake up this and other conversations when we do our wrap-up episodes in another month or so. So yeah, there's a lot to talk about here and there's no easy answers. But this is part of our ongoing thoughts as we navigate through the pages of this book.
I have a bonus quote.
Go. Get it.
All right, this is Ursula K. Le Guin in the book called No Time to Spare, which is a collection of her blog pieces she wrote in her 80s, so they're so good. This article is called Utopia Yin, Utopia Yang, and she's talking about yin ways of life and yang ways of life, and I'm not going to go into too much of what that might look like, but the end of the essay says, is a yin utopia a contradiction in terms, since all familiar utopias rely on control to make them work, and yin does not control? Yet it is a great power. How does it work? I can only guess. My guess is that the kind of thinking we are, at last, beginning to do about how to change the goals of human domination and unlimited growth to those of human adaptability and long-term survival is a shift from yang to yin, and so involves acceptance of impermanence and imperfection, a patience with uncertainty and the makeshift, a friendship with water, darkness, and the earth. And so here with Le Guin, I feel like she's kind of saying we can have goals and be receptive and uncertain and changing.
Yeah. We can work to create the yin utopia.
Yeah.
Thanks for being with us, y'all.
See you guys in a couple weeks.
It just started raining. If it's springtime where you are, like it is for us, happy spring. Get out there and get it while you can.
Yeah.
Love you guys. Bye-bye.